it, the command of Jesus was to go into the world and preach the gospel to every nation. And the promise, I've been emphasizing that since Paul does in Romans, that when the covenant was made with Abraham, it was that all the nations of the world will be blessed by your descendants, your seed. And it was failing to do that that got the nation of Israel in trouble. They took, and this is the hardest thing for us human beings, they took that they, being God's chosen or elect or select, all those words mean the same thing biblically, being selected by God to be his people, they took that as a privilege to be puffed up about. And even though many of their leaders and many of their teachers, the Talmudic scholars and all, taught that it was a matter of grace, that Abraham was selected not because he was the best person in the world or whatever, but because God wanted him to choose him. And he was chosen to be a responsible person. And even Abraham, you remember, he blew it several times in his life. And the whole history, the holy history, what the Germans call the Heilsgeschichte, the history of holiness, as through the ages, people failed until the Messiah came, and he fulfilled the covenant responsibility. Now, that's a very important idea. It's one that isn't emphasized as much as it should be, but that's Paul's whole argument in Romans, is that the Messiah came, and through his actions, he proved the faithfulness of God. Do you remember back in the first chapter of Romans when I translated the passage in Romans 1:18 where it says, people say from faith to faith, and some translations it's from faith from the beginning to the end and all. That just doesn't quite fit, because it is apo in Greek, from, and ek, out of, about God. And I have translated it, it is from God's faithfulness to our faith.
Yeah.
God proved faithful in keeping his promise. And since he did, then we accept the work that was done by his Son, and that's our faith. And so God proved faithful. Hebrews teaches the same thing, that he swore by an oath. He was talking about a little different thing than the covenant with Abraham, but it's still the same principle. And when God makes a promise, he keeps it. That is the security of the believers, is that God has promised and he will keep his promises. Our job is simply to believe in those promises and to the best of our ability, live our lives in accord with that faith. That's what James is talking about when it seems like he might be teaching something contrary to what Paul talked about, salvation by faith. All he's saying is that the kind of faith that saves is a faith that works. It's not that works earn you salvation, it's that your salvation motivate your works. And that's an important difference. And it should motivate our works. If we really believe the promises of God, it's going to change us, folks. You remember when we talked in Romans 6 about we are baptized into a new state of being, and that we are different and that it's an objective difference. It's not just a subjective feeling. It's an object. We have new privileges. We have the assurance that our prayers are heard. We have the assurance that our prayers somehow or other affect the whole universe. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what will. But that we are participating, and here is the great thing. It means that you and I are participating in the redemption of the whole creation. Now, that's not that we are indispensable to God. That means He graciously has allowed us that position. And so I can pray about the condition of the country. I can pray about the condition of the world. I can pray about things happening in Uzbekistan, or that's the one we were talking about, or Kazakhstan, or Ukraine, and know that I have the ear of God. I have the ear of the Lord of history. Now, I'm not saying that I can pray, little Charlie Prince down here, he can solve all the problems of the world by praying. It means, though, that my prayers are I'm going to use C.S. Lewis's phrase, my prayers are factored in to the things that happen, and on even a cosmic scale. Now think about that. I'm going to have a little wild ride of imagination just for a second. Maybe I can affect a black hole that's at the center of the Milky Way universe. Now, as I say, I'm being a little bit facetious there, but I'm trying to illustrate the point that I want to make, that our prayers do in some way have an effect on the redemption of the universe. Remember that the plan of God is not that He will just redeem human beings. We want to reduce everything to individual salvation. Paul was wiser than that. He saw that God was going to redeem the whole universe. He says that universe has been subjected to meaninglessness because sin came into the world, and that the universe groans waiting for the revelation of the salvation of children of God. When we are totally redeemed and receive our resurrection bodies, it will be in a new heaven and a new earth, one in which sin cannot occur. You've read my book, you know how I deal with that. I asked the question, what's different if God's original creation allowed for sin? What's going to keep the new creation from being sin? How would you answer that question?
One word, Satan.
What?
Satan. That's the difference. There's no more Satan.
Well, that's, but I'd rather look at it this way. Christ has died and been raised from the dead. God has intervened into the world so that sin is not even possible. You know where it says, I will wipe away all tears? You know that old song? God will wipe away all tears. We sing it, and it's got different voice leads, and it's a great song. We miss that, and I don't know how I'm going to translate it when I get over to the book of Revelations to translate, because it doesn't mean just like you wipe tears out of your eyes. It means God's going to wipe the possibility of tears. In your resurrection body and mind, there will be no tear ducts. That's the way I say it. There will be no possibility of crying. Now, but where will there be a possibility of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth? That's a distinction that's made. Now, I'm not going to get into Edward's teaching about, and more I'm beginning to think he's got it right, but we won't, that's for a different lesson. We stick with this. Now, we're talking about here in this section in Romans about the meaning of that historical intervention of God. And we're talking about the Jewish people. That's what the section from 9 through 11 is about. Remember, Paul has twice said, if it would help them, I would be lost. He was passionately in favor of his people. He never ceased to be a Jew. And I think that's important. And one reason he brings this up to the church at Rome, you remember that a few years before, Claudius Caesar had thrown all the Jews out of Rome. Suetonius tells us it was because of arguments over one Christus, and that's probably Christ in a distorted way. And he expelled all the Jews. You remember Priscilla and Aquila, that's the way Paul met them in Ephesus, was that they had been expelled. And so there was a strain of imperial anti-Semitism in Rome. And Paul wanted the church of all things not to be so Gentile that they felt free to criticize and do bad things to the Jews. And he is explaining what happened to the Jews. And what happened to them was they didn't live up to the covenant that God made with them when he called them into being. They were to cause his name to be honored among all people. They were to show forth the glory of God. And as their prophets said, they failed that miserably. Isaiah says one place, it's not only that you didn't make my name be blessed, praised among the nations, you made it a curse word. And that's the thing. And as a result of their failure, they were scattered. And now, the Jewish thinkers at the time of the New Testament had this idea that the return from the exile was incomplete. And that's a background to both the Gospels and the Pauline epistles, and for that matter, for especially Peter's, First Peter is written against that background. And that it was when the Messiah came that the Jews would be genuinely brought back together. Now, that process had not happened. And that's the background idea for what Paul is teaching here. He's explaining what happened to them. Remember, he said that salvation came when you heard the message about what Christ had done, and you believed that with your heart and confessed with your mouth. Now, that's not two steps. That's not two different things. That is just the two sides of one coin. What's in your heart, Jesus, you remember what Jesus taught about that? That's what's in your heart is what comes out of your mouth. So this is a natural process. It's not setting some legalistic standard that you have to meet. It is the natural thing when you believe something, to talk about it. You say it. And that, I think that's something that we do not take seriously enough. We think we have to have some kind of special training or something to tell others about Christ. I remember when I preached in Beaumont, we had one of the best outreaches to young college students. That's one reason I went to preach at Westgate in Beaumont. Nearly half of that congregation were college students that went to Lamar State University. And we talked a lot about that. And some of the older people would think that you just had to, have some special training, something you had to go to college or something to learn how to witness for Christ. And there's people who leave that expression. I'll use it this way. Do you know how to fish? How many of you have ever fished? Do you think you could tell somebody how to fish? I'm not talking about catching. I mean just how to fish. What I'm saying is, anything you have done, you can describe to other people about it. I'm very much in favor of washing my hands regularly. I'm not obsessive compulsive about it, but I do. I could tell somebody how to wash their hands. The thing I'm getting at is, if you have believed in the promises of God and have acted on them, all you have to do is tell people that that's what you've done and what it meant to you. There's no little 5 steps. There's no little handy answers to religious questions. All these, in my lifetime, I've seen all those things tried to use, and it's artificial. And it becomes artificial. I have the greatest respect for the young men who the Mormon Church sends out. They are very faithful and all. But as far as I'm concerned, their great weakness is, and this would include people like Jehovah's Witnesses and others, they have a set pattern. And if you get them off the pattern, they're lost. I know, because I guess I'm a little mean that way.
It's even better if you get them off the porch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I ask them questions that they're not ready to answer. So, but what I'm saying is, if you have become a faithful person, you have accepted the promises of God, and you're living your life in accord with them, you can share that with people. Now, they can ask you questions you can't answer. You know the best answer to a question you can't answer? Is I can't answer it. It's the truth. Nobody knows everything. I have a lot of people, I remember when I was raising my kids, sometimes they would ask me questions I couldn't answer. And they wouldn't take that. They'd say, oh, you just want us to look it up or something like that for ourselves. And I wouldn't know the answer.
That is in direct contrast to the churches that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
As far as when somebody presents them a question, that's part of the rote that they are involved in as far as the communications.
Yeah, I do it. I don't want to have a negative. I don't want to accentuate the negative there.
I don't think it's unique to those organizations. I think that's the response of someone who has been taught religion instead of Jesus.
Well, yeah.
Where does the word come from?
I would agree there, but
6 words. Here is what happened to me.
Yeah. Yes.
Every argument.
And nobody can successfully deny your experience. Had you ever thought about that? You know what you've done, and you know how it feels, and you know this, and I like that. See?
They can ignore it, but that's a different issue.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when Jesus restored the sight to the blind man, and the leaders were questioning, how did this happen? How did this happen? He finally said, I don't know. All I'm going to tell you is I was blind,
And now I see. That's exactly.
Can't answer that for you.
And thank you for reminding me of that, because that's usually the example I use to illustrate this point, and I wasn't thinking about it here. And he was a simple man. He might have been a little mentally handicapped. I don't know, but you could read it that way.
Yeah.
But he knew one thing: I was blind, and now I see. And that's what I'm getting at. Okay, he goes on. He said, but not everyone has believed the good news. Now, I put good news here. It's the word gospel. Huh? 10, 14, and 15. No, it's not. It's 16. 10, 16. He's using good news here. And it's not the gospel about Jesus Christ. He's talking about the Jewish people. Their good news was what? What?
Released from Babylon.
God is faithful. Okay, that's a pretty good summary of it. It is God brought you out of Egypt with a high hand. And God helped you conquer the promised land. And God has established you and done, it was the story of what God had done for them. But they did not really believe that when it's down in the practical thing. It was so easy to go, and the remnant of the Gentiles that were left, the Canaanites in the land. I've used this example many times. Here is an Israelite farmer, and he's got his crops down. And here is a Amorite farmer, owns the land next to his. And this Amorite farmer goes out every morning and makes a sacrifice to the goddess of fertility. And lo and behold, the grass always looks greener on the other side of the fence. And this farmer gets to looking, and it may be because he has better soil. It may be because he's a better farmer. But what is this poor, simple Israelite farmer going to think about? Why, that goddess is stronger than my God. Now that's exactly it. Now, I don't know the name of the Israelite farmer or the Amorite. I'm just using that as an example of what happened. And so the Israelites would practically forget all the things that God had done in the moment of seeing all these gods and goddesses being worshipped. And we think, how could they do that? How could we forget things that have happened in our history, which we do a lot of times? One thing that we have forgotten, from my perspective right now, is what happened in the Great Depression of the late 20s. Remember, I was born 18 months before that started. Now, I didn't study economics at the age of 18 months. But I do remember living in a tent for 10 weeks.
Where at, Charles? In Conroe?
No, Kilgore, Texas. And we lived in that tent because they declared martial law in the East Texas oil field, and the Army was in such bad shape, or the 36th Division, the National Guard Division in Texas was in such bad shape, they didn't have any office personnel. And so my dad was he trained in office procedures, and they hired him at the rate of a staff sergeant, and that included housing for the family. And so when martial law was taken away, they graciously allowed us to stay in the tent because we didn't have any place else to go. And so when I hear people talking about economic things, I remember the tent, and it gives me a different perspective. You better believe it gives me a different perspective. I can remember Roosevelt saying malefactors of great wealth, and that there are certain circles in this country that if you use that phrase, you'd be ostracized on it. But
Have you ever seen the Ken Burns documentary on the Dust Bowl? It's amazing. It is excellent.
well, I lived it.
Yeah. It's like for
Yeah,
all of us,
yeah.
if you want to get grateful about your life,
Yeah.
watch the Ken Burns documentary on the Dust Bowl. It'll blow your mind.
My mother lived in Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl, where the Dust Bowl was really
I had
bad.
no idea. You know.
And they had a locust invasion, and she would tell us the locusts not only ate every green leaf and plant, they ate on the handles of the axes and the hose where sweat had gotten salt, and and it would look moth-eaten. We have pictures in
And
an
a lot
album.
of people compare the Dust Bowl to God's judgment. You know. against,
Yes. So.
the country and.
So let's don't get too political. I'm just using historical events to show how quickly we can forget things.
One generation.
Yeah, no, it doesn't take one.
It doesn't even take a week. Like, you know, last month I paid. I mean, God helped me pay all my bills. And this week I'm like, how am I going to pay my bills? You know, what's up with that? Why can't we remember? Why can't we remember?
Okay. All right. So the point is made. So the Jews did that. They said, but not everyone has believed the good news. For it is just as Isaiah says, who has believed our message? Now that's the reason I said it was a message to the Jews, because Isaiah was speaking to whom? The Jews. And so he's talking about, now this is a parallel. Paul was big on parallels. That just as they didn't listen to the good news about God's promises in the Old Testament, they were repeating in this generation the same effect. They were not believing the gospel, the good news about the Messiah's coming. And he's effectively saying they are repeating in this generation what their ancestors did. How often do you find that in the New Testament? Do you remember when we studied the book of Acts, Stephen's speech? And it is made up of, you are the fit descendants of your ancestors who did this to the prophets of God. And that's it. Paul is effectively doing the same thing here. And it is that they didn't listen and remember the good works of God and promises, and they're still not doing that. Now, Paul wants to jolt them out of that indifference, that not hearing.
Isn't it ironic that Paul's saying that, something that Stephen said?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. He said, isn't it ironic that Paul would be saying the same thing that Stephen said, because we're introduced to Paul as Saul, who held the garments of those who stoned Stephen. Yes, there is, and I'm sure that one of the informing experiences of Paul's life was that irony, that he was very zealous. See, when he says that Jews, I witness that they are zealous for righteousness, but they don't have the knowledge. That is the knowledge of Christ. And he was full of zeal, but not according to knowledge. He experienced that. He said, it therefore follows that faith comes from the message that is heard, and the message that it is heard concerns what Christ has done. See? Their good news in the Old Testament was concerned what God had done for Israel. And Christ, Jesus, is, as Messiah, he is a representative, and he is the representative Jew, the one who kept the covenant faithfulness and demonstrated that God is faithful. God had promised that through one of the descendants of Abraham, the whole world would be blessed. And as I pointed out, the only human being that is a blessing to all people, both past, present, and future, is Christ on the cross. He went one down to every human being who will ever exist, and therefore he carried away their sins, to use John the Baptist's phrase. Like a beast of burden. You don't think about a lamb being a beast of burden, but that's the picture that John says when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God, which bears the burden of the sins of the world." My translation there, and that's the comparison. The lamb becomes a burden carrier, and he takes all the sins of the world. He said, "But I asked, did they fail to hear? Yes, truly they did. For their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the entire civilized world." Now, what he's saying is, the Jews failed to hear, and it's obvious they did, because the message went all over the civilized world. I always think here, when I read this, about Rahab. She had heard the message about what? What God had done in the Exodus. See? Rahab heard, even if the Jews didn't hear, all of them didn't. And that's what he's talking about. He quotes an Old Testament scripture that says the message went out to everybody. So, what Paul wants you to realize is that the Jews' failure to hear was a moral failure, because the message was there. It wasn't for lack of knowledge, it was from lack of faith in that knowledge. Then I asked, they did know, didn't they? And this is one of the reasons that I decided I would make a translation of the New Testament. Here is that rhetorical question that no English translation ever makes. I've never seen one that did. And it makes a difference, because he expects your answer. If he says they did know, didn't they? What does he expect the answer to be?
Yes.
Yes, they did. And so it's more a statement than it is a question. There's no doubt in Paul's mind. So he says it that way. They did know, didn't they? First, Moses says, I will provoke you to jealousy by a people that is not a nation. Against a Gentile nation devoid of understanding, I will anger you. God then said, since you are going to fail to listen to the good news of my promises, I'm going to provoke you by raising up Gentile nations. See, that was one of the things that the Jews found very difficult to understand. In fact, they found it so difficult to understand that they just didn't understand, they couldn't, evidently, understand it. For instance, in Jeremiah came along when God had decided that Israel didn't deserve a second chance. I hate to say that after Max's sermon about second chances, but remember, God promises second chances. I don't know how many times, but he's not talking so much about individuals as he is nations. And the nation no longer deserved God's protection, and he was going to withdraw it from them. And he would use Gentile nations. Back to Jeremiah, he said, don't tell me the temple, we have the temple. Jeremiah was telling them God's going to destroy things, and they said, God can't destroy us, we have the temple. We have God's presence here. We're better than other nations. Are you going to use a nation worse than we are? Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? But I'm not going to go there. But that's the argument that Paul is making here. He says, then he goes ahead, and I like this next one. Then Isaiah, comparing boldness to the limit, also says, I was found by those who were not seeking me. I was manifest to those who were not asking for me. Now, who are those people? Gentiles. And what Paul is saying here is, that's the ultimate result of the Jews' failure to hear. That's the ultimate of God using Gentiles, Goyim, to try to provoke Israel to jealousy so they would straighten up and fly right. Now, I want you to begin to hear Paul's argument here that is applicable to you and me. Because from now on through the end of the 11th chapter, he's going to be telling Gentile believers how they ought to behave with respect to Jewish unbelievers.
Isn't that part of what Jonah's message was and the reason for it? To show that even the Ninevites could accept God's mercy and grace when they wouldn't?
Yeah.
And Jonah didn't.
You remember Jesus uses that same argument in his ministry.
I find it difficult because, let's say, in my own life, the people I'm jealous of, and I get angry, jealous to the point of anger, I don't know how well that is a tool in changing me, my perspective. It just kind of makes you dig in your heels and be bitter.
Yeah.
How well does that work?
I'll tell you what. But it means that the behavior of those people should be that you act in a way to provoke them. Jealousy, in its basic meaning, is I want to be like you.
Or it's I'm lacking something that God's not giving me.
Yeah. Well, now that's one aspect. Envy and jealousy are two different things, and I don't want us to put too much weight on jealousy, because jealousy is in our culture and in our psychology, almost totally a negative thing. And that's not what the word means, but we don't have any other word. And you better believe I have researched that. I got a thesaurus down.
That's why it's so hard for us to understand that God is a jealous God.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. There is no other word available, but it doesn't really carry just automatically the connotations that we want. Okay, but to Israel he says, all day long I've been extending my hands to you, a stubborn and disobedient people. In other words, God knew that groups of people that did not seek him, and he would be manifest to those that did not ask for me. The Gentiles did not, as far as we know, want God, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, the God who is maker of heaven and earth. Almost without exception, the intelligentsia among the Gentiles of the time were anti-Semitic. They did not want the God. So it was almost, see,
They did not want what? What did you say?
didn't want God, the God of the Bible. But God sent anyway. You remember, while we were still enemies, Christ died for us. And
Yeah.
and that, do you notice how the book of Romans sticks together? How it is, it's a unified piece, and yet so often we study it as if it were little individual bits of wisdom or something, kind of like the book of Proverbs, just little, but it's not. It is a continuous argument from just after the salutation and the greeting. He starts his argument, and it's a continuous argument from that through chapter 15. And they're connected together. Okay. I ask, therefore, starting in chapter 11. Notice the therefore. What does therefore point to?
The stubbornness of the Jews.
What?
The stubbornness of the Jews.
Well,
The
it
rejection
is
of
the
God.
argument he has just made.
Right.
It's what's called a retrospective. What is it? An adverb? I guess it is. I'm not sure though. It's or is it a? It's not a.
Conjunction.
What?
It's not a conjunction.
Yes, that's right. It's a retrospective conjunction.
It is?
Yes.
I said that.
A conjunction.
I
Yes.
was just guessing. Where's Rebecca?
Uzbekistan.
Yeah, she literally is in Uzbekistan.
Is she really?
Yes.
Let me text her.
But that, see, a conjunction is a word that connects together.
Thoughts, right?
And so that's what it is, a thank you. See, even in ignorance, we
I get the sticker.
Yeah, okay. It's referring to the whole train of argument that he's made. I ask, therefore, did God repudiate his people? Now, there is the question. That is the question that Jews brought against Paul's teaching at the time he was doing it. That is, Paul, you have become an apostate, and you're preaching anti-Semitism. And do you know what? There's a whole body of post-Reformation teaching that teaches the same thing. And it's wrong. He was not. He was, because this is a sign of it, because he immediately says what? Absolutely not. This is me genoito. It means it's a prayer. It's in the form of a prayer with a negation in front of it. And this is the famous phrase that the King James translators translated, God forbid, knowing that there was not a word for God nor a word for forbid in the two words. But it is a prayer, a negative prayer. And who would Paul be praying to? God. So I was tempted to translate it that way, but I think we get closer to where absolutely not. He's saying, now, you can't get any stronger negation than that. So that means that's not what God is doing. The grafting in, and I'm using Pauline phrase that we'll have in the rest in this chapter, the grafting in of the Gentiles in the place of the Jews to be God's people does not mean that God has repudiated the Jews. Now, we're going to get in some real ticklish and distinctions, a little difficult thing here. This is the passage that people who believe that Israel is, as a nation, is a fulfillment of God's not repudiating the Jews. I do not believe that. I don't think Paul teaches that here. I think it is contrary both to fact and Scripture. And absolutely not. I'm saying, but that he is open to Jews as Jews being saved. Yes, I think that the more probable fulfillment of this is what we call Jews for Jesus. I was had a time when I was eating breakfast here at the building, got here early. I picked up a book out of the church library that was, it's Jesus in the Passover, and it's written by a believing Jew. It's a really good book, and I think I'll check it out. I didn't check it out, I just got it to read while I was eating my breakfast. If I'm just eating, time passes very slowly, so I won't something up.
Jesse brought up Jonah, which got me thinking about. This is really what happened to Jonah. I mean, Jonah at the end, when Nineveh is saved, a non-Jewish city in a non-Jewish country is saved, he assumes God is not with the Jews anymore instead of realizing. And then God provides for him by having the leaf. Little
gourd plant.
Yeah. Shade, provides shade for him, whatever. It's not one or the other.
Yes.
It's
both.
basically the fourth chapter of Jonah is really saying that.
Yes, and
I have compassion on these people.
yes, and that's God. Notice he didn't select the Jews to give them special privileges. He selected the Jews to give them special responsibilities, and that may we who are of the elect now, maybe we ought to remember that. Let's go on then. Absolutely not. For I myself am a descendant of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, Paul, see, he recognized that Jesus was the Messiah of the Jews. And there was no reason except their own stubborn unbelief. And Jesus himself realized that. How often he talks, how often he uses parables that say the same thing in his public ministry. And he he even showed compassion. You remember when he looked out over Jerusalem and he wept?
Even the 40 years in the wilderness was a picture of this.
Uh-huh.
One generation had rejected him.
Yeah.
And so but the next generation was accepted and went into the promised land, even though they still had their problems too.
Yes. Paul wants us to see the work of God as a seamless whole from Genesis to Revelation. I've shared with you when my first class in Bible at Abilene Christian College, it was then, was an old man named R.C. Bell. And he did not know Greek or Hebrew, but I would put him up against anybody in the English Bible. The Bible was a living creature for him. And the first thing he told us when we went, and I'm so grateful for it, that I started my college level study of the Bible with a man who had this vision of it. He said, the Bible opens with God and man at peace in the garden. And the Bible closes with man and God at peace in the garden. And everything that happened between those two events is the story of how God caused it to happen that way.
That's
We
cool.
can't even look at it as Old and New Testament. It's all the same.
Yes, it's all the same. And I remember that my heart beat faster. I thought, I've been looking for this all my life.
Beautiful image.
What?
It's a beautiful image.
It is. And that has stood me in good stead. I could have gotten somebody that saw the Bible in pieces. And I think I would have come out, you always think that you could overcome things like that, but I'm not sure. And the more I think about it, maybe God chose it that way because I wouldn't have come out like I did without it. You can look back and see those moments in your life.
You know, Charles, that's incredible, what you just said about going to Abilene Christian, because the whole time I was being raised, it was split up. It wasn't taught as a complete story, it was taught in pieces.
That's right. That's the reason it was just like water to a thirsty man. Because I have the kind of mind that wants to integrate things. And there it was. And my preaching and teaching life since then has been a commentary on that idea. And I bless God for it. I remember years later at a preachers and elders dinner at the lectureship at ACU then, and it was a put-up job. And they asked everybody that had been preaching for 25 years or more stand up. And there was nearly half the people there. Then they said 35 years. And they said 45 years. And people began to sit down. They said 55 years. And it was just a bare handful. They said 65 years. And one man was left standing. And it was R.C. Bell. He had preached 65 years. And had a standing ovation then. And he's my hero. If I have a hero as a human being, he is. Because that set me on the right course, because that is Pauline theology. I don't know whether Brother Bell knew that. I think he probably did, because he was sharp. He never had an education past high school. And the reason he started preaching was that he was teaching high school because he was the only person in East Tennessee that had even gone to high school. And a little church in East Tennessee asked him to come over and preach a 7-night, what was called a gospel meeting, revival or something. And he did. He rode muleback 7 miles each way after teaching school. And he did it for 7 nights. And they took up a collection to pay 35 cents. A nickel a night. And he said that was the most precious money that he ever saw. Anyway, getting back to Paul, I want you to catch that idea. See, this is not just a group of beads on a string. This is a continuous flow of an argument. And now he's gotten, there is in some ways, this is the climax, even though most people see in Romans 10 through 11, 9 to 11, they kind of see it as a detour or a side road or something, but it's not. It's the same story all the way through. And that's what we are going to do. Our time is about up. Alicia?